Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. This is a pre-recorded programme for Wednesday the 18th of May, and in this programme we'll be talking about the United Kingdom and could we see within a generation the break-up of the United Kingdom. Now when we look at the issues involved, we see for example that Sinn Fein has taken the Northern Ireland Assembly known as Stormont in Northern Ireland. And also we see that Nicola Sturgeon's Scottish Nationalist Party are doing well politically and they are calling for another referendum. So we're asking, within a generation, could we see the collapse of the United Kingdom? Reagan, this is such an important topic, and I think because of Partygate and all the political scandals involving COVID, that our political leaders aren't really focused on the danger of the breakup of the United Kingdom, as we've seen that recently in the recent local elections, Sinn Fein have done extremely well in the polls in Northern Ireland, and they've taken the Northern Ireland Assembly, Stormont. So in the first time we see a shift in power away from the Unionists now towards the Irish Nationalists, the Catholic camp, for the first time. We also see that the Scottish National Party is there's no one competing with them in Scotland, and they are calling for more pressure for the UK to have another referendum in Scotland to gain their independence. So, are we witnessing the breakup of the United Kingdom, or certainly could happen within a generation?
Such an important question, Simon. I think when we consider the past few years even, we can see that while we continue to be called the United Kingdom, in many ways we're far from united in how we act and how we function in the relationship between the various political parties across the devolved governments. We have to remember that we, yes, have a Parliament seat in Westminster, but so many issues have been handed over to each country's own parliamentary processes. And so functionally, even in how we've dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, how we're dealing with and speaking about the EU, how we're dealing with Brexit, how we're dealing with the Ukraine-Russia element, various elements of trading interests, fishing, wars, whatnot. We talk about oil and fracking and all of that. Each nation has very different opinions on this. Northern Ireland, the DUP has some very real concerns with protocols concerning the border and following the Brexit vote and following the activation of the Brexit vote. Those concerns are held as legitimate across not only Ulster, but you have in Scotland as well concerns that are in their interests. So you can understand, you can look at the concerns of Scots in regard to their own sense of what, I hear it. People say everything seems to be very England-centred, London-centred, and you can look, and if you put yourself in some people's shoes, you can understand some of the gripes, you can understand some of the complaints, but unfortunately, I think what we've seen, especially in the past couple of years, is an escalation of this to where an increasing number of people don't really see the point. And it looks like what could have been a great thing and what was arguably a very good thing for the past few centuries may well fit that statement, all good things must come to an end. I would not be surprised that the UK breaks up.
I mean, this would be tragic if this were to take place. Not only would then transfer the, essentially a lot of the finances of London and England are actually subsidising Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So I mean, if, for example, the United Kingdom were to break up, Scotland would find it extremely difficult, and so would Wales.
Well, depending on how
because
the
it's a dependency relationship as well. So I don't think that the Scottish Nationalists have really thought this through, because in the one argument they're making is that they make the argument that they want to be independent of England, they want their own nation state, but then they want to be directly back into the EU and surrender all their sovereignty to the EU. So, you know, that doesn't make any sense.
I think it's the only way Scotland could function, though, independently of England.
They wouldn't be independent. They would place one. They would gain their independence and then lose it again to Brussels.
And they're not seeing it that way.
But that's the reality of it, and that's what we've got to address really from this one as well. But also what's concerning as well is the prospect of Sinn Fein, who are kind of far left Marxist political party, taking over Stormont in Northern Ireland and pushing for their desires to create a united Ireland.
They're essentially Republican. They are Republican.
So essentially then you would see, and this is the irony, isn't it, that Northern Ireland is the most British of all the home countries, because they want to be associated with Britain. They're proud to be associated with their British heritage. They're more British than anyone in England, Wales or Scotland. I know that's a big statement, but you only have to go to Northern Ireland to see that, and I've seen that for myself. So they're certainly amongst the Protestants, but with the Catholics, it's more support. They want a unified Ireland. They want to be associated with Dublin. So you have all these different complexities involving history, society, religion, and what have you. So it's a real complicated mess. But should we start? Should we start where it all began, where the history of the Union was actually formed?
We have to go back to the sources in order to understand this. It's no good talking about the breakup if we don't talk about the marriage. And so we have the Act of Union of 1536 declared English King Henry VIII's wish to incorporate Wales within his realm. The Welsh were to be accorded the same political status as the English and to send representatives to Parliament. In keeping with English common law, out with Welsh law. None of this came into effect until 1543, however, when all the details were laid out in a second act. Still, Wales and England had been unified. And you can go back previous to that, you can see even England, we have to remember, was a motley crew of various kingdoms constantly warring with each other up until really the medieval ages. So that's...
And after that as well, the War of the Roses.
Yeah, exactly. So we've always had that turmoil to some degree. The Acts of Union passed by the English and Scottish Parliaments in 1707 led to the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain on 1st of May that year. The UK Parliament met for the first time in October of 1707. Here we look at the relationship between the two independent kingdoms of England and Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries and explore the critical period leading up to the passing of Acts of Union by both parliaments and what happened afterwards in the development of British identity. And Simon, maybe you can talk us through some of those three acts of union which are so key to this discussion.
Absolutely, which are represented, believe it or not, in the Union Jack, the British flag, though sadly we don't see so much of now as we used to see. So the Act of the Union are the key. The UK flag, the flag of the Union Jack, a great visual aid for keeping the story straight. But the story started a long time before the flag came into existence at the beginning of the 17th century. So the Irish rebellion of 1798 and the fear that Ireland would be the launching pad for a French invasion led the British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. If you've seen any of the Blackadder series, then you know exactly who I'm talking about. At this great time between Great Britain and Ireland, Pitt argued that the Union would help develop Ireland economically. He also claimed wrongly that it would also make it easier to grant concessions to the Roman Catholics, who would then become a minority in the new United Kingdom. So the British government overcame strong resistance to the unification by nakedly buying enough votes to ensure that majorities in both British and Irish houses for a passage of yet another Act of the Union, and this occurred on March the 28th, 1800. The Act of the Union that created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland came into effect on the 1st of January 1801. And let's put this in context, this was during the Napoleonic Wars as well.
Yeah. Now, the Union remained in place until the recognition of the Irish Free State, excluding 6 of the counties of the northern province of Ulster, while the Anglo-Irish Treaty concluded on December the 6th of 1921, following the Irish War of Independence. the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 1921, just right after World War I. We've not known much peace in the past century. If it's not a world war, there's local wars that we've been involved in, and indeed you can see monuments to that in Dublin. You can see monuments in Ulster that reflect on that particular conflict. The Union officially ended on January the 7th of 1922 when the treaty was ratified by the Dáil. Finally, May 29, 1953, by proclamation, Elizabeth II became known as Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's taken us to where we are today in a general historical sense. There's been constant turmoil. Interestingly, Simon, in some historic study, I look at what's happened in the Celtic nations, how the Celtic nations have been treated at times by the Anglo-Saxon, England essentially. And I understand the pain. I understand the heartache. I understand the upset. I understand the bitterness to a degree that has been caused by atrocities committed, by negligence of these nations going back centuries. You can consider Cromwell in Ireland, and just reprehensible treatment. You can go back even in areas of London where you had signs in the 70s that were blatantly racist against the Irish and other groups. So you can see an angle wherein this has carried over, and we're still reaping fruit of various bad decisions and bad behavior on both sides.
Yeah, but we've also got to recognise as well that the English imposed English on the home counties, Wales and Scotland and Ireland, and took away essentially their own native languages as well, which looking back on it was not a good thing.
No.
And understanding their culture and their heritage and stuff as well. But you do see a marked difference whenever you go into Wales, and I go there quite frequently, or go to Scotland or Ireland. There is a remarkable difference between our nations. But the thing is, our nations have been united, and I think we've also got to put this in context that it was because our nations united that we were able to be the first industrialized nation through the Industrial Revolution. And God raised up this nation to send missionaries out throughout the entire world with the British Empire. And also the commitment and fought alongside each other in blood in the Napoleonic Wars, fighting against Napoleon. Now, what I didn't know before this program is that the British government was very concerned that the French might use Ireland as a launching pad for the invasion of Wales and England. I never knew that. So that was something that would have been in their strategic thinking to bring the Irish in for that reason alone. So we know that the Irish, we know that the Scots and the Welsh fought alongside the English to defeat Napoleon, then followed during the First World War as well, sacrificed their lives, and even there was opposition within the Republic of Ireland, was still under British governance for Irish people to go and fight. Many did go and fight and risk their lives fighting for freedom in the trenches. And then, of course, World War II. But during this time, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, remained neutral in the Second World War. So, we are blood brothers. We've sacrificed the lives of each of our nations for our freedom. So there is something very special about the United Kingdom, and especially when we end up playing each other in kind of World Cups or European knockout teams. So there is that friendliness, there is that rivalry, but also think that this is the way that God made our nations to be individual nations, but also part of one big nation. And we wouldn't have the influence we have on the world today if we weren't a united force.
If you look at Acts 17, Paul says very clearly that God is the one who's working in and establishing out of his sovereignty even the boundaries of nations, the nations in which we live. At the same time, we can see how he sovereignly works in the dissolution of nations through chaotic and bad choices on multiple parts. So You can look, I've been to Scotland on several occasions, and I cannot say that there's good stewardship of the cities or of the land. In many ways, I see that there's rampant drug abuse. I remember visiting Glasgow, and in one particular area was working along with a church, knocking on all sorts of doors on this area. I did not encounter one single house that did not have someone who was either high at the time we were speaking with them, drunk or borderline, or clearly suffering with substance addiction. This is a problem. You can look at the statistics. It's rampant throughout Scotland. There's rampant depression. There's total in some areas, just I say total, that's, forgive me, that's an unfair generalization, but there's an extreme lack of regard across a significant part of the populace in regard to the things of the Lord. You know, here we have a nation that has a rich Christian heritage. It really does.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet the scene today is you encounter individuals who are angry at the very idea of God. You have a coldness, you have extremes of legalism and liberalism within many of the churches that are functioning. And so my experience there is a beautiful nation is that it's being run into the ground politically, spiritually, in so many ways. And I think that the same could be said for other areas as well. Wales, you know, there are.
Well, look at the Welsh. Well, look at the Welsh revival in 1904.
Yeah.
You can't get a more incredible heritage than the Welsh revival, and the impact that had on the minds and the surrounding areas, particularly in South Wales, and then moved up to North Wales. A number of churches that were built at the time, and unfortunately, that generation then went on probably to die in the battlefields in Flanders. During the First World War, but the impact that had was absolutely huge, and of course the revivals we've had in the Hebrides and Scotland, and of course we owe our Christian faith in this country to the Celts, like the Iona Celts and others that kept the gospel burning during the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. So you know we know that God's hand of destiny is upon our nation, upon our isles, and they've got a particular calling. And of course, our nation was also called to give birth to the nation of Israel in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So the mandate being given to this nation and these isles and these countries is something absolutely extraordinary. But I think that relationship changed when Britain entered the EU in the early 70s, because you know if you see footage back in the 1960s, we take the 1966 World Cup for example, you didn't see one George Cross flag there. It was all British flags. They were all waving the British flag, supporting England beating Germany in the World Cup final. And so patriotism was kind of British. There wasn't a sense of, I'm English, or maybe you would have felt if you're Welsh or Scottish or Irish, but certainly when the English were concerned, they would consider themselves British.
Yeah.
So I think that our relationship with the EU has changed that. And then as we progress more into the European Union, we come across a very important political term called subsidiarity, which is a deploy of the federalists in Europe to transfer power away from national parliaments, give it to Brussels, and then hand it back to the regions. So effectively what we've seen, and this is what we're paying the price for, is the weakening of Parliament, of Westminster, giving more powers to the regions, and then the dissolution of power to Scotland with the Scottish Parliament being established in the 90s through Tony Blair, the Welsh Assembly as well, and all of these things have taken power away from Westminster, which has then heightened the desire of the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish to Northern Ireland to gain independence and have their own independence as a nation state.
A few things that we can analyze as well from conversations that I've had in various regions about why certain regions, including in England, are so depressed, and why there are whole cities, for instance, that are on benefits almost, and why you have in areas like Cornwall, in Wales, in some areas, in Scotland, this hatred. And I've asked this question. I was talking with a man who's lived here a significant length of time, but he grew up, first 20 years of life in Scotland. What's the issue? I asked, why the problem? He put a lot of it back, and I hear the same thing, to the what he called a lack of empathy in the Thatcher era, where many people felt completely hard done by. The unions were dissolved, and the mines and whatnot were closed. So there are economic grievances that people have had, people losing their livelihoods and whatnot over it, that play into this discussion as well. Whether we would agree with the solutions, whether we would agree with everything that's behind that or not, there definitely is this sense that Westminster did nothing to try to help ease the situation of the pain of miners, for instance, and hence you have so many completely depressed communities.
Yeah, but I think, Reagan, we have to go back to the 70s and the winter of discontent and the absolute shambolic Labour government of the 70s to realise that we had energy shortages, a 3-day week. I mean, this is the decade that I was actually born in, so I can't remember much of it. But I do know, for example, that then Margaret Thatcher came in and completely changed everything with supply economics. Right. And this is where we saw Britain boom. We had a Prime Minister who pushed above her weight, and our nation pushed above our weight, particularly with the Falklands War, taking back the Falklands Islands literally 40 years ago. So when we see all this in context, we have to understand really that there are social problems and there are social differences, and there's winners and losers. And of course, the south of England, particularly where we are now, London, the southeast, has kind of prospered quite amazingly, but the old industrial heartlands of the north have failed. And this is why I think Boris was talking about levelling up, and then the previous Chancellor, was it George Osborne, was talking about trying to set up a fast rail route to the north and build big power centres in the north. I mean, Manchester, I think, is going through a bit of a renewal and stuff as well. So it is possible, but obviously it means the nature of the economies had to change. Old industries, once you could buy cheaper goods from other places around the world, there wasn't much point us producing our own stuff if it's going to cost, and it wasn't profitable. So no one's making any profits, can't make any money from it. It's a whole privatization. So yeah, I think all these things do play a part, but also it's like anything, isn't it? It's decisions that are made have a knock-on effect, whether for the good or for the bad. And of course, it was a very brave decision, I think, of David Cameron to give the Scots their own referendum back in 2014. So let's have a look at this CBN news item that goes all the way back to September 2014, on the eve of that crucial referendum, and when the Scots were given the opportunity whether they wanted to be part of the UK or not.
Voters in Scotland are heading to the polls today to vote on whether to secede from England. The country's united 307 years ago, and Scots are pretty much evenly divided on whether to stay or go.
Basically, we can still have the backup of the United Kingdom, which will give us the security we need in a globalised world.
It's a great dream to start in a new country with a new sheet, with a multicultural country. A country of, it's not about nationality, the vote. It's about a place being able to look after itself.
High turnout at the polls is expected today.
And indeed, there was that referendum, and Scotland voted to remain in as part of the Union.
By 55%.
Yeah, by 55%, which is significant. It's close, but it's significant. At the same time, Simon, we're potentially looking at another referendum. Now, in 2014, all I remember hearing is this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We're not that much older than we were in 2014, and yet here we already have talk of
8 years later, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the definition of lifetime, what sort of lifetime are we talking about? A fish? I don't know.
Maybe a rabbit.
Yeah, a rabbit, something like that, yeah. So let's look at how the Scottish Nationalists responding to the success of their local elections in May, because as we've seen in the past couple of years, politics has turned on its head yet again. You know, you can look at a range of variables as to how and why. These are local elections, not national. Will people have, I'll put it this way, the guts, you know, to continue voting for parties that they haven't voted for in the last general elections, for instance? Come a new general election, is this just a punishing vote to help ease things in local authorities? Well, the First Minister has said she is certain of a fundamental shift in politics across the UK following local elections. Nicola Sturgeon has also said that she is confident one of the changes will be Scotland becoming an independent country. And indeed, Nicola Sturgeon, her predecessor as well, have been very big campaigners for this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Alex Salmon, I think you're talking about as well. But also, at the same time, in Scotland, we've seen the collapse of the Labour Party. Because before, Scotland, was so important to the Labour Party in terms of winning a general election, because there were so many Labour MPs north of the border. Now we've seen that the Scottish Nationalists have taken over that, and so therefore they're blaming everything on Westminster, the London government causing all the problems, and so therefore they're able to say, look, this is Westminster's fault, so therefore, vote for us, and Nicola Sturgeon's been able to capitalise on this. But I think we also got to recognise as well the impact that the EU referendum in June of 2016 has had on our nations as well, because we know that, for example, Northern Ireland voted on the whole to remain in the European Union. We see, surprisingly enough, that the Welsh voted with some of the English to actually come out of the EU, but the majority of the Scots wanted to remain in the EU. So I think all these things have also caused tensions within our nations, because now we're on our own. We're no longer part of a European confederation, and we have to gain our own independence. I personally think we're much better off. We're no longer on EU laws. We're no longer being a prospect where we will be forced to become part of a European superstate. But let's have a look at this old CBN news item, and this was reported back in January the 1st of 2020, and you can only look at this video and see how much the world has changed over the past 2 years and a half.
3, 2, 1. Britain's 47-year relationship with the European Union officially ended at 11 p.m. Friday night to shouts of jubilation by Brexit supporters. The party is over and Britain is out of the European Union. And now Brussels will be watching nervously to see if another European nation will follow Britain out the door. Italy, Poland, Denmark, and Finland are all said to be unhappy with the European Union. But are they unhappy enough to leave? And Britain still has an 11-month transition period until 2021, before its last ties to the EU are cut. Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage says he likes the way Boris Johnson is handling it so far.
I mean, he's saying we won't have any jurisdiction from the European Court of Justice. Good. We're aiming for a Canada-style trade deal, which means the rest of our economy won't be bound by EU rules. Good. No regulatory alignment. Good. In fact, it's everything I've ever wanted.
But there is a sense here that Britain has just stepped into the unknown, and those who opposed Brexit fear rough times ahead.
Depressed, downbeaten.
But Brexit supporters believe that for their great nation, the future just got brighter.
Things are going to be tough in the beginning, but I think we're going to make it. It may take a year, may take a couple of years, but you know what? It smells like freedom.
Dale Hurd, CBN News, London.
Well, it seems forever ago that referendum actually took place. I remember, Simon, it was incredible. We had loads of people in our local area. I live in Islington, handing out stickers. There was an American friend who was doing an internship with the church I pastor, and he knew where I stood on a couple of these issues. So he had gone out in the street and was they were giving all of these stickers out. He came back and he had deliberately put on all of these stickers saying "I'm in," as in that it was one of their campaign very pro-EU stickers, just to wind me up a bit. But there was this sense of optimism that we're going to stay in the EU, and anyone like myself, I'm sure you experienced as well, who had expressed concerns about remaining, had expressed concerns about being in the EU, and had identified not only where it was, but where it's going. This idea that we were horrible human beings for supporting Brexit, and that there was no chance the nation would be so vile as to vote to leave. And yet, as the results began pouring in, there was a shock, I think, among many that, especially of the champagne socialists set in Marlborough.
There's
anyway.
quite a few in these. Yeah. That's where Tony Blair comes from.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just down the road from Mr. Corbyn and Thornbury and all of that particular set as well. So you kind of look at it and you think there was just a complete, especially in London, a total lack of national awareness that this is where it was going to go.
Yeah, but that's because Londoners on the whole are probably more selfish than the rest of the country. They're very economically minded. If this is good in terms of business, this is good in terms of money, then let's stay in.
Yeah.
That's the nature of London anyway, and London always has been. So, that probably did play a big part of that. But let's also not forget that the Remain campaign had the whole apparatus of government behind them. The whole civil service, all the government institutions and offices of state to support their claim that we should stay in. Anyway, earlier today, I recorded an interview on this whole very thing. Is the United Kingdom in danger of breaking up? Now joined on Behind the Headlines by Michael McCann, who's the director of Britain-Israel Alliance and a former Labour MP. His constituency was up in Glasgow in Scotland, so the perfect man to talk about the State of the Union. Michael, what are your concerns regarding the state of the Union, the United Kingdom? We've seen that in the local elections, Sinn Fein have taken Stormont for the first time. We see that Nicola Sturgeon, on behalf of the Scottish Nationalists, is calling for another referendum. Could we eventually see the breakup of the United Kingdom as it stands?
It's entirely possible, Simon. I hope it isn't the case because I and many people like me defended the Union strongly in 2014 when we went through the referendum in September 2014. In fact, we paid possibly the highest political price because you'll recall that in the wake of that referendum result in Scotland, the nationalist feeling was so high, it was so hyper, it was so crescendoed in terms of the whole campaign surrounding that referendum that 6-7 months later, when the general election took place, people, in my view, departed from their senses and they voted for a majority of Scottish National Party MPs to represent them in the UK, which is, if you analyse it, and you analyse what Scottish National Party politicians say, they say, well, the Tories are in power, they're terrible, the Tories, we have to get rid of them. However, you can never get rid of them with SNP, because SNP can only win seats in Scotland. The Labour Party could win seats in Scotland, England and Wales. Obviously, we know Northern Ireland is a different kettle of fish. But the bottom line is, you can vote for a party in Scotland and they can become the government of the UK. You can't vote for the Scottish National Party to become the government of the UK. And therefore, there's a complete contradiction in many of the slogans that they use. But in particular, in Scotland, we have got a hardcore minority, and it's a significant minority. And all they need to do is continually turn out election after election. And if their people turn out It doesn't matter if the turnout is 50% as it was for the local government elections, or 40% or 30%, or higher than that. The bottom line is, if their hardcore supporters turn out, they are going to win the day, particularly in first past the post elections. So therefore, I think we're at a very dangerous time in British politics. We have no giants. We have no giants in terms of the leaders of the main parties. There is turmoil both in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And obviously, I would hope that things calm down and that people don't make or don't reach conclusions which are based on the difficult economic circumstances and where the country finds itself just now, rather than and confusing that with the constitutional politics which lasts forever, or just about forever.
Michael, as a proud Scot, maybe explain to our viewers how important the Union has been to the United Kingdom, the fact that we are an island off the coast of Europe, joined together with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that we are a force in the world because we are a union. And if our nations break up individually, then of course we won't be a strong force in the world. What are your concerns regarding this argument that if unionists and those who support the union don't actually fight for it, could there be a danger that we lose it because we're not advocating how essential it is for Britain's future, but also Britain's prosperity as well?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I don't know, every part of the historic analysis from 1707 onwards. There are people who are far more blessed with that intellectual capacity and knowledge than I. But let me put it in a modern context for you. In terms of where Scotland is, just purely geographically in the map, it's at the periphery of Europe. If you cut Scotland off from the rest of the UK, there is no draw through from Scotland through England to the ports down in the south of England, which then lead on to Europe and allow us to sell our goods and so on and so forth. And I think the nationalists, every time there's a problem, every time you raise an issue with them, which would cause us a real problem as individual Scots, and quite frankly make us poorer. I mean, actually poorer, not just in a speculative sense. That they just ignore it and say, no, that won't happen. But they don't give you any detail about how they're going to resolve it. So we will have a massive fiscal deficit if we became an independent country. And quite frankly, someone like me in my age group in my 50s, and your viewers will be the same, who've been hardworking during their lives, who have built up a pension pot, who maybe have savings put away, will be less affected than the new generations come through, who will have to start afresh. And we'll have to watch a recalibration of what they can expect in terms of their pensions, what individuals can expect if they're unfortunate enough to be within the benefit system, if they're disabled. These are the sorts of things that are going to come home to roost, because the only way that Scotland can afford those things at the moment is because it's part of the United Kingdom. Now, let me be swift to say, I am not talking down Scotland. I look at Scotland as part of the larger UK economic entity. And if you look at history, and if you look at, for example, the mills which were producing fabric for the whole world in places like Manchester and the Midlands, those were the powerhouses of our economy. And then we had the change to fossil fuels, and the mines across our country made a vast contribution to the UK's wealth. So sometimes it's when industries run out of their natural lifespan, and then another part of the UK comes on and drives a new part of the economy, which creates the wealth that we need to keep our country in a healthy position. And over the decades, over the century, that is where the UK has proved its worth. Quite frankly, I'm less worried about the swirling of bagpipes and wearing kilts and all that Scottish stuff than I am about the absolute arithmetical calculation, which means it's imperative that we stay in the United Kingdom. And incidentally, that issue is even more compelling when it comes to Northern Ireland.
I can elaborate because, this is the first time really that Sinn Fein have actually taken power in Stormont in Northern Ireland, which is very troubling, especially when we consider the history of Sinn Fein, its association with the IRA, and its desire to pull Northern Ireland into a united Ireland.
Well, the Sinn Fein are green Trotskyites. They're hard left. individuals. And in terms of the historical alliances, that people know that and they know all the issues there. But by the same token, if you look at the figures from last week's election, I think there's a trend across the United Kingdom where, because we don't have those big figures that we've had in the past, love them or loathe them now. People like Tony Blair, people like Margaret Thatcher, just to demonstrate that I'm balancing the politics there. These have been big figures and they have commanded respect, whether some like it or not. We don't have big figures in politics. So what you saw in the local government elections last week, in my opinion, and in the elections in Scotland and Wales, was a position where people didn't know who to choose. So that's why we saw a rise in the votes for the smaller parties. And the same is true of Northern Ireland. The Unionists, if you look at the distribution of the vote, still with the highest percentage in terms of all the votes cast, the Unionist parties. But of course, they're divided. And it's perhaps Sinn Fein have benefited because they have been a unifying voice for the people who support their objectives than the Unionist community. And that is a danger for the Unionist community if they don't get their act together. But let me tell you, when it comes to analysing the economic figures for Scotland, and each man and woman and taxpayer in Scotland is subsidised to a significant degree by taxpayers elsewhere in the UK, England, the bottom line is it's double that case for Northern Ireland. And I was reading an analysis, in fact, that Dublin wouldn't even want to be involved in a reunification with the North because it would even have more significant cost per capita than the reunification of West Germany with East Germany. And that is a pretty staggering figure when it comes to the realities of life. I'm a great believer that, albeit that, and I can say this now that I'm not a politician, I used to have to chap doors and people would say things to me which were completely bonkers mad. And you had to just take it in the chin and be nice, but try and explain to them as subtly as you possibly could without calling them an idiot, forgive the blunt language, why they were wrong. The situation is that there's a sizable proportion of my fellow Scots who are getting this argument completely wrong because they can't absorb the arithmetic. And the people who can't absorb the arithmetic are the very people who will suffer the most if there was ever an independent Scotland. And the same is true of Northern Ireland.
And Michael, finally, doesn't our Prime Minister Boris Johnson need to kind of wake up to these new political realities? Otherwise, if we don't campaign for the union, we'll lose it. So isn't it important now that he makes this a priority of his government to protect the union and also make the political arguments for the United Kingdom? Because if we lose the United Kingdom, I dread to think what economic state we're in, what kind of power we'd have in the rest of the world. And we're only strong because all our nations united as one.
Well, it's coming across very strongly now that Boris Johnson flies by the seat of his pants on a lot of occasions. And whether that's Partygate, whether that's the Beergate issue in terms of the Keir Starmer issue, it doesn't matter how minimal the issue is. When it comes to dealing with things, and this concerns me because when I was involved in politics, I used to think very carefully about even how attending a particular event could look if it was misconstrued. And if I was doing that, if you like, in the back benches of the House of Commons, not as a frontline politician in terms of shadow cabinet or anything like that. But he doesn't seem to apply that same logic, and he's the Prime Minister of the country. And that's deeply disconcerting. Now, the saving grace is that there's a procedural element to independence, which means that Section 30 would have to be deployed to allow Scotland to have an independence referendum. We can't do it without the agreement of the UK government. And there's an argument where you should call the SNP's bluff and say, right, okay, well, let's have a referendum and then dictate the same way as SNP Alex Salmond dictated the procedures and rules in 2014. We should do the same for the next one. So it shouldn't be yes or no, which is a strong positive and a strong negative. We should adopt the remain in the leave position which we used in the European referendum. But it is a gamble, because if you lose it, you've lost it forever, because the union between Scotland and England started in 1707. It's still going strong. So there's nothing to suggest that if you break it up, it could ever be put back together quickly. And when the English contingent of the United Kingdom realise that they're actually getting a cost benefit of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom, despite all the familial ties and the history that we have together, the fact that we've fought together in 2 world wars, that we've died together in 2 world wars, if people actually voted for independence, very, very difficult to glue that all back together. And that's why Boris needs to get some advisors beside him who are brighter than the current contingent, because these people, in my view, are not taking this threat seriously enough.
Michael, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines tonight. Thank you for your knowledge, your insight, and your expertise, particularly in this very important discussion as we talk about the importance of the Union and the United Kingdom staying together. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for that helpful interview there. Really insightful, and I'm sure our viewers found it very useful. Northern Ireland, Simon, the situation in 2021, 100 years after the creation of Northern Ireland, Boris Johnson tweeted, "Let me underline that now and in the future, Northern Ireland's place in the UK will be protected and strengthened." And yet, now we're in a situation where we're actually talking about a Republican Party, we'll call it what it is, with connections to the IRA historically, undeniably, is the leading party in Stormont. It's an incredible turn of events. It could indeed, I think, unless we have divine intervention, unless God intervenes and rectifies this, set the foundation for a dissolution of the Union.
But we also see in the Republic of Ireland that Sinn Fein are on the verge of winning the next Irish general election as well. So that confounds the problem. But don't you also think as well that if we look at Zechariah, I think it's chapter 14, it talks about how God brings the nations into the valley of Jehoshaphat because they divided my land and scattered my people. And if we look at the historical role that Britain has played in dividing the land of Israel, ever since we had the British Mandate, we gave more than half of it away to Jordan, the trans kingdom of Jordan. We then wanted to hand it over to the UN. The UN had a partition vote in 1947. And it's been the policy of the British Foreign Office to create a Palestinian state. Now, isn't maybe the case whereby we're seeing our nation as being very involved in the Middle East peace process? And if we are then dividing God's land and his land, he then divides our land. We already see that he stripped our empire of us because of our treatment towards Israel and the Jewish people. So if we continue to push for a Palestinian state, isn't the direct consequence of that our own nation disintegrates?
The covenants that God made with Israel throughout the Old Testament were primarily unconditional when it came to the land. We have conditional covenants and unconditional. In relation to the land and other outsiders' treatment of Israel, the covenants were unconditional. So those who bless are blessed, those who curse are cursed.
Absolutely.
Across the board. We see that even how God uses sovereign nations, evil nations in judgment upon the idolatrous Israel and Judah, those nations come to a bitter end. They come to an end that sees their power completely stripped and ultimately humiliation.
But how can our nation, for example, or our nations as such, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, have a real blessed future if Christ is not at the centre? Because we were blessed because God was at the centre. He was, his name, the name Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus, the King of Kings, was above Parliament. It was in our parliamentary, it was in Parliament, it was in our institutions, it was in our monarchy.
Queen's vows. Yeah. Here we are in this Jubilee year, and the Queen's vows at her coronation uplifted the one true God and vowed to be a defender of the faith, There was a sense of absolute truth, a sense of the objective veracity of the Holy Bible, there was a sense of the Christian God is the one true God.
And even Winston Churchill as well, didn't he, in his speech during the Second World War, saying we are fighting in defence of Christianity.
Yeah.
And of course we had the national days of prayer and repentance that took place. The King George organised, calling for the nation to pray and intercede during those dark days of the Second World War. So we know that our nation has an incredible spiritual heritage, but we've turned our back on it. So are we following the same kind of repeated behaviour as ancient Israel did in rebelling against God, turning to idols and foreign gods? And as a direct result, we see God take his hand of blessing upon our nation, and as part of that judgment, as it were, we're seeing the breakup of the United Kingdom.
I think that's very likely. I think that we've seen throughout the past century a real sense of progress in some areas, but particularly in the past, even you could say the past generation really, and the past 2 generations almost certainly, a decline. This hasn't come out of nowhere. We're seeing the fruit of many years of bitter sowing. And, you know, I think, Simon, that we do have to go before God as a nation. As individuals, yes, but as a nation, there has to be repentance. There has to be change. There has to be the ceasing of this equivocating on objective truth and biblical principles, suppression of truth. You look at Romans and you see that there's this, in Paul's letter there, a warning to those who support those things that go against God's clear commands. There's a recognition of God's patience, a recognition of God's love, and yet at the same time, there's a point in time when God does remove a nation's place over other nations. We see it historically throughout. He will bless, and then as nations continue to live in idolatry and aggression against him, he removes.
So I think we as a nation have committed 4 major sins. The first sin is abandoning the Jewish nation at its birth during the Mandate years, and fought against Israel's independence, that we were instructed to bring about the rebirth of the modern state of Israel. We've removed God from our schools and our places of power and influence, such as Parliament. We have a godly queen, but for how much longer? Her son certainly won't be. So that's another issue. We have millions of babies that have been aborted in this country, so the blood of the land cries out, and we've allowed foreign gods into this country and foreign idols. So when you look at all that and you put that all into balance, these are things that grieve God's heart. And until there's a kind of fundamental repentance, and that means a turning of behavior, our nation is not going to be blessed. We're not going to see our nation united, because it's only Christ at the head of our nation can we see that unification of our nation. And God cares about nations as well.
He does. He is the one, again, who gives us our dwelling place, and we have to repent. We have to keep our focus on proclaiming his truth to others, that we might see some saved. But we've had this coming to us. We may well see the kingdom remain united.
But we've got to pray for it.
We have to pray. There has to be prayer. And so that's my pastoral call to our viewers, that you would pray for this, our united kingdom, that you would pray for our Queen, that you would pray for a change of heart in government, in those who are our leaders and authorities, that they would know the truth. And as Scripture promises all, that they would be set free, that we would be set free by the truth, that we would remain united. Thank you, Simon, for joining this evening. Thank you, our viewers. We'll see you soon next time on Behind the Headlines.